Mhm. So, hello. I'm Katharine West. I'm Margaret Irwin West's third daughter. So, yeah. So, I was born in Edinburgh, where my parents lived for a while, and my brother and I were born there. And then, when I was 9 months old, we came over to the west of Ireland first. And that became a huge kind of toing and froing connection between our family and the west of Ireland. And so eventually then we settled in Dalkey in County Dublin. And I kind of grew up between two coasts, really, the east and west coast, and always near the sea. So it was a lovely upbringing. And
Yeah, I've been interviewing some artists lately, and one of the things that always interests me is at what point did they feel that there was an artist within them? Now,
yeah,
most of them didn't come from
yeah.
artistic background, but you, I mean, you were steeped from
Yes,
the beginning.
yeah. Well, making things in our family was always important, and thinking about things and reading. Both my parents were voracious readers, and they both loved stories, I think, as well, and both were great conversationalists. And we were quite lucky growing up. We didn't have television for a lot of the time, so we were quite resourceful in terms of what we did. And when we were in Connemara in the west of Ireland, we had no telephone, no television, and none of those kinds of things. So we became very good at amusing ourselves. So drawing and making was part of that. And also, our mother, she had four children and was still trying to continue her practice. So we were often on the beach with her, but she would try and kind of, I suppose, isolate herself a little bit and do some drawing. So maybe one of the ways of communicating with her was to draw as well. A huge part of our growing up was about looking, and both my parents were very visual, really. My father loved being on the water, and so he took us out in his boat, and he used to say, well, it wasn't just about fishing, it was about being on the water, you know. And we were very lucky. He'd often see that we were getting kind of restless in the boat, and he'd leave us on Friar Island, for example, on our own, for a couple of hours while he went off and fished and came back. So we had an extraordinary kind of regard on the world, that was very uncluttered, and Connemara in those days, that was 70 in the 70s, it was a very it was much less developed as a tourist area than it is now, and so there was something very pure about it. And really too, and I think coming from Dublin, everything was less complicated when one went to the west of Ireland, and there was no pressure. There was no pressure from friends or context or anything like that. When you went west, you could just do your own thing and kind of pass under the radar, really. And in those days, people didn't worry so much about children, so we could just go to the beach and we just spent the whole day there, really. And we got fed in the morning and fed in the evening, but we were very resourceful. Yeah. She had. My mother was very passionate about what she did and about the visual arts. So, from a very young age, we would have gone to exhibitions and galleries with her, and she was wonderful at taking us into the National Gallery, and even again, it was another era, but even going to church, you know, our mother was very. She was very funny. She used to take the illustrated Bible to church with us, and it was a very beautiful one. And so we were allowed to just look at the pictures, which were beautiful and very dramatic. And then when it came time for the Eucharist, she would lift my brother and I up look, and it is a very dramatic thing, the Eucharist, and so she was always, getting us to look and see, and I suppose, she's very interested in understanding the landscape and the environment in which we were growing up. But just as much as Connemara was beautiful, Torquay was very beautiful too, because it's completely hewn from granite. So, that was something that was very special for me, especially since I became a sculptor. I never expected to work three-dimensionally. I didn't know what I would do, but uh, I do think all that beautiful granite in Torquay had a huge influence as well. It can't be changed because of the granite, so the same cracks are in the pavement that were in the pavement when I was a child. And you've also got these extraordinary views. So from the back of our house, we had bay windows upstairs, and we could look out to the sea, and we could see Torquay Island, and we could see all the rocks and the whatever was out there, and the horizon line. So that was very beautiful. And the colours were maybe a little bit different, and obviously the sun rose in Torquay and the sun set in Connemara. So that was a different thing. Mm. When we were small, my brother and I used to get taken to the art school in Dunleary. My mother was teaching an access course. So she used to start quite early in the morning, and then we'd do pottery classes. Richard was about 8 and I was about 10. And we did them with Alison Kay, who is a very well-known Irish ceramic artist herself. But anyway, we were tiny. We did pottery classes for quite a long time, and again, neither of us thought that we would necessarily work three-dimensionally. But I suppose, that thing of being able to manipulate materials, that was something that we were immersed in for quite a while growing up. Yeah, but I think, fundamental to making anything three-dimensional is drawing. And so drawing was a huge part of my childhood growing up. And actually, when my mother taught in Dunleary, there would have been a life model, and I was allowed to draw as well, at a very young age, 10, 12, So I started life drawing, which was a great privilege, really. Yes, so when I left college, when I left school, I went to NCAD, and in those days you did a pre-diploma year, so that was kind of like a foundation. And then I decided to do what at the time was called craft design, so it was glass, metal and ceramics. And so you did sort of all three for a year and then specialised, and it was clay was the one material that I really loved working with. Although glass was fascinating and metal was fascinating, but I suppose I just really loved the malleability of clay and what it could do. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't really worry about it too much. What I did actually for the first the first few years at NCAT is I did joint honours. So I did uh, the normal course, and then an extra kind of 50% of art history. So it's like sort of taking two courses. So that was very nice. I mean, in those days things were a little bit maybe possibly too separated from an educational point of view. So fine art was seen as something very separate from craft. But what was nice about doing the joint honours was then I was back with my friends who were studying fine art, and so I didn't feel I didn't have to acknowledge the kind of compartmentalisation that maybe happened intellectually at NCAD at the time, and all of that has changed hugely in terms of contemporary practice now. But at the time, I suppose craft was seen as something much more applied, and fine art was seen as something much more experimental. And so, uh, anyway, I navigated my way along and didn't really make anything terribly functional when I was at college, although I did learn how to use the wheel and things like that. But I think from fairly early on, I was interested in expressing ideas through clay, possibilities. Yeah, yeah. So what happened was when I was at NCAD in my final year, one of our externs was from Strasbourg, and so he said, well, what are you going to do next? And I was lucky I was able to speak French, so I was able to speak French with him. And so, I was chatting away, and I said, well, I'd like to study some more, but I'm not quite sure where or how. And he said, well, why don't you come to Strasbourg? And so he set up an interview for me and everything. And age 21, I went off to Strasbourg and spent a year there. One of the reasons I did that as well was because after 4 years of studying at NCAD, I was just coming out with what was called a diploma at the time. We didn't have the framework of qualifications that we have now, the Bologna framework of qualifications. So, it was all a bit confusing. So, anyway, doing that extra year uh, at Strasbourg meant that I came out with a degree, and so that was important. But also, really, it was just wonderful to be on the continent and to be able to travel to Switzerland, to Basel, to Stuttgart, to Paris, to anywhere on a train or whatever, and see a lot of art because the other thing that was happening in Ireland at the time was that we didn't have a museum of modern art. We just had, uh, exhibitions, WOSC. We had WOSC, and that was very important. But they just happened every 4 years, the WOSC exhibitions, and then you could see a lot of contemporary art that way. But otherwise, you had to travel to see contemporary work. I mean, I was very lucky in that when I was growing up, I used to go over to France quite regularly. So I went over as an au pair girl and things like that, and worked in Paris. My sister was studying languages, my sister Caroline. And so the first year in college, I went over and spent the summer in Paris. It was lovely, just waitressing. Again, having lots of time to look at work. I worked opposite the Pompidou Centre. And so in my lunch hours, I used to do split shifts. And in my lunch hours, I could go down to the Louvre when it was before the pyramid was there, and you could just sit. There was a lovely little garden. You could sit there and chat to people in the garden, and then the different galleries had different doors into them, so you could just go into a gallery, look at Michelangelo for like 10 minutes, and then go back to work. So it was very nice, very interesting. After Strasbourg, I came back to Dublin, and I wasn't quite sure, how I would kind of maneuver things. And while I'd been at NCAD, I'd met uh, a Polish American ceramic artist, Marek Sekula, and he lectured at Parsons School of Design in New York. And so he had chatted to me as well about what to do next. And he said, well, you're very welcome to come to Parsons if you'd like to, but I think a place called Alfred, New York would suit you better. They are much more interested in expressing themselves through clay there, whereas, Parsons was more of a design school at the time. And so that sort of stayed with me. The other thing that I suppose you have to remember is that there's no internet, so it's really quite hard to find information. But I did, when I was at NCAD even, I started to notice people who'd studied at Alfred, and yeah, Tony Hepburn was one of my lecturers, but he was actually British. Tony and Pauline, they were wonderful. So yeah, Tony Hepburn. When I was So after I finished in Strasbourg, I was in Dublin for a bit, and then I went to Milan to work with the potter, Guido Dezzan. And Guido had a little bit of a library, and so I made work with him. And then in his library, I found a lovely book, and in that I discovered that Tony Hepburn was actually lecturing at Alfred as well. But by then I'd already applied for Alfred, and then it was a question of how to fund it. And so that's how the Fulbright came in then. Obviously, I've been to France a lot, but I hadn't been across the Atlantic before. So I was a bit like I was trying to learn to drive before I went to America, and I remember driving around Connemara, feeling like I was, you know, about to. I was like one of those people about to fall off the edge of the world, when we thought that the world was flat. And so, yeah, it was a big leap. And so off I went to New York State. And Alfred is actually 360 miles from New York City. So it's near the Pennsylvania border. So it was all a big adventure. I stayed a couple of nights in New York City in the YMCA, the place, again, you didn't know where to stay or anything. And so that was an experience. And then I got on my bus to Alfred, and it took 6 hours to get to Alfred. And then, anyway, yeah, I spent 2 years there. And so, well, there are a few very big courses around the world in ceramics, but Alfred is probably one of the biggest and most immersive sort of experience that you can have at postgraduate level. So, uh, you know, that was very exciting. And so you have 4 semesters, and so each semester you have an advisor. And so I was very lucky. I had Tony Hepburn as my advisor the first semester. So he was great at kind of helping me navigate some of the sort of vocabulary between where I come from and the kind of educational experience that I'd had, and then what was happening at Alfred. So he was great and very challenging as well. How your work develops is a little bit about how you place it, how you put it in a context. And so ceramics in Ireland and Britain at the time were a lot about technical virtuosity, and how something looked, and because of that art and craft divide as well, I hadn't sort of seen my work as art necessarily when I went to America. And so one of the first questions Tony Hepburn asked me, he said, well, Catherine, are you a sculptor or are you a potter? And I said, well, I'm not a potter really, because I didn't really make things that function, but I don't know if I would, I think I probably said something like, I think it might be a bit pretentious to call what I do art. And I said, I think my idea is very simple. And then he said, not at all, Henry Moore was the simplest man in the world, just get on with it. And so that was very liberating to see my work as art as opposed to craft. And then as well, you are working within different parameters, and those parameters for me were very exciting, the parameters of what full bin space could do. It was the 1980s, so at that time there were a lot of people working as object makers, but making very, very large objects. So, people like Tony Cragg. When I was at Alfred, I started to experiment a lot with different clays. We used to mix our own clays up from scratch. So I could work with a red clay, but I could add burnout materials like sawdust and things like that, so that the surface would become very porous. Or I could add glaze so that the surface reflected light or was coloured. Also, depending on what you put on a piece, it's either pleasant to touch or unpleasant to touch. So the surface could be quite seductive or quite, I suppose, much more aggressive, depending on what you did with it. But I was very interested in how form absorbed light at the time. So the porosity of the clay was very important for me when I was at Alfred. Although I did experiment a little bit with terracotta sigillata there, what I did more was I fired pieces at different temperatures, and the clays had different maturing temperatures. So clay, when it reaches its maturing temperature, uh, it basically the surfaces actually fuse, you know. So uh, I was ending up with some very porous surfaces and some quite shiny surfaces, depending on how high I fired the clay and what was in the clay. So I was lucky enough with red clay and then with kind of quite browny black clay, and mixing up all these recipes from scratch, which was great because you could just add in everything that you needed then. And then I also made quite a lot of white pieces while I was there. And then when I left America, I continued to make work and things like that. But I was always quite I suppose struggling with the surfaces, and more I became more interested in form and less interested in colour, really, I suppose. And then in 2000, I went to the Work Centrum in the Netherlands, and that's a kind of experimental research centre for people working in clay and artists who wish to work in clay. So all kinds of artists have worked there over the years. Uh, it's an unusual way of working, and I mean, I would work in series, and the series would have a kind of umbrella kind of set of ideas. And then also there'd be a series of drawings involved in those. But at the end of the day, you might just have decided what your starting point is, but you don't know. I mean, what's exciting for me is to not know what the end point is. So the kind of really exciting bit is between the beginning and the end of the piece and all the possibilities that might happen in between. You know, but yeah, it's true. You're working from the inside out, but you're kind of, you're creating. You're actually kind of creating a kind of a wall, that is suspended in space, you know, and there's air inside and there's air around the outside, and so it's kind of like a layer that's just held up in space by the material. The more you know, the more you can predict the outcome of what happens in the kiln. But yeah, I mean, it depends how you work with ceramics. I mean, the way I work is fairly predictable in terms of what might happen in the kiln. But, I suppose in the beginning that it prepares you for the shrinkage. There's a huge amount of shrinkage that happens during the firing. And then, yeah, obviously the surfaces tighten as well because the material itself is made out of little platelets, and they actually fuse together. Um, and so, yeah, it's very exciting. But you can see, yeah, I'm interested in how it kind of, levitates in space, so it's all the shapes underneath the piece as well that interest me. And it's you can make a piece on a flat surface, but it's not, for me, that's not very challenging. Suppose if you have something that has a whole other thing, it's all about how form hits a plane for me, and it's quite difficult actually. For a long time, when I made installations, I would put everything on the ground, but the difficulty with that is that when you're above the pieces, they are flattened by the view from above. So now I do tend to actually put the pieces on plinths again because you can see how the piece into plays with the flat surface. Well, you see, yeah, when you're growing up, you have to carve out your own life, for yourself. So my mother taught at the art school in Dunleary, so I went to NCAD, on purpose because I wanted my own world. But my mother followed me, and so the only thing is she was on a different campus. So I just never mentioned that she was my mother. And so she was at Leinster Lane and I was at, Thomas Street. Uh, and so she had joined the Faculty of Education at NCAD when I went there. She came about a year later. And Yeah, and it was quite funny then. The NCAT bought one of my final pieces, and then my mother came along, kind of just at the opening, and Noel Sheridan was there, and he said he used to call her Maggie, and he said, "God, Maggie, I didn't know she was your daughter. If I'd known, I wouldn't have haggled over the price." So I just kind of kept things very. I just can't. I just lived my own life. But at home, my mother would worry, I think, and she'd be very exigent if she saw a drawing book of mine. She'd want me to organise it in a particular way. But then she was looking at things from an education perspective and things like that. But most of the time, I don't think I listened to her very much when I was at art school, really. And at that time, she was very busy. She was teaching art, and then the days that she wasn't teaching, she went to the Black Church print studio. So, yeah, I don't think we spent much time during those years working together or anything like that. But we would have. She would have encouraged me hugely when I decided to put a portfolio together for art school. And my best friend as well at the time, Kathy Cleary, she was applying for art school as well. And my mother, was great. There was a big storm that year in Dublin, and all the schools were closed for 2 weeks just before we were putting in our portfolios. So Kathy used to come over to my house every day, and my mother would set us an exercise at the drawing room table. And So we drew, and she'd come and look and encourage us. She didn't really criticise us, she just encouraged us. And um, she was very good at just making very, very gentle suggestions as to how to um, experiment with line and form and things like that. And so we had some lovely moments when I was preparing my portfolio. She was fantastic. How I talk to students about how to use line and how to vary line and how to maybe not put anything there at all sometimes when you can't see something, rather than trying to put something you think is there. Just to look and to you know take confidence in the process of looking. Things that I found difficult to get my head around, but then when I taught them, I found them so easy to teach. Like perspective, I would have struggled with perspective, I think, in first year in art school, and yet, when you look at the theory of it, then and teach the theory of it, then it becomes very straightforward. Um, uh, Otherwise, well, drawing is just an endless journey. I think for anybody who's a visual artist, it's just something that you keep going forever, and you keep experimenting with and questioning, and you always have it. I always say that to my students. No matter what they do and what they specialize in, and how difficult it is to access studio space or equipment or whatever, they always have their drawing. They can always draw. You can draw anywhere, anytime. It's always accessible. And you can draw with very basic materials and on very improvised surfaces, and you can always achieve something. That was a funny one. So after America, well, I stayed on and worked as an artist in residence in Portland, Oregon, and then I came kind of back and forth. I was living in Dublin, and so myself and some friends lived in a beautiful old house in Hogwood Terrace in Dublin, and so I had a lovely kind of double drawing room with my bedroom one side and then my studio the other side, looking out over the canal. It was very, very lovely situation. And then my friend Laura O'Hagan, she had kilns kind of further up the canal, and so I could fire the work there. And so I did that, and yeah, just always made sure that I kept making work, really. And then at some point I started teaching. I taught right the way through my MFA degree in Alfred. I had a teaching assistantship, so I had quite a lot of teaching experience by the time I came back. And then, as an artist in residence in different places, I taught as well. So even after Strasbourg, I would have taught in a kind of, um, a colonie de vacances up in the mountains above Strasbourg. And then I was an artist in residence in New Zealand, in Dunedin, and would have taught at the same time. And then I started teaching in Dundrum College. It was a PLC, so I used to teach life drawing there and art history. And then I started teaching in Dunleary actually. Um, so I used to teach in the evenings, and there was an access course there. And so I had a few students who were never going to make two-dimensional things, on that course. Those access courses are often painting orientated, for that one was anyway, but they had these lovely kind of forays into other media, and one of them was ceramics. So I had some brilliant students in Dunleary. And then my husband, my late husband, Frank Stapleton, he was writing a new script in the west of Ireland, and so he was based in Carrow, and my father was very unwell in Conmar at the time. He had terminal cancer, so I was going back and forth from Dunleary to the West a lot. And Frank said, "Oh, why don't you get in touch with my friend Patsy Murphy?" I don't know if you remember Patsy. She used to teach at the college. So anyway, she said, "Oh, you must come in and meet so and so and so and so." So I came down to Galway as a visiting lecturer and met Rob Death. And so that's how I kind of, uh, I'm Marion Coy, and they wanted to set up a ceramics program, a full-time ceramics program. So I came really to help do that. So I came down as a visiting lecturer a few times, and then literally from the bottom up was involved in setting up the ceramics program. So the first year we just had the second years, and then we had second and third years, and then we had fourth years as well. And then so also there was another thing where it was it was just kind of the early 2000s, and it was impossible to find somewhere to live and have a studio in Dublin very easily. And so it kind of made a lot of sense for us to move west. So we actually, when we first were married, we lived in Hollyman, County Mayo, and we bought a beautiful old Presbyterian manse and a church. And so we were going to, I was going to have the church as my studio, and Frank was going to fly in and out of Knock, you know. And unfortunately, Frank became very, very ill. Um, and so I had already started teaching in Galway by then. And then I kind of made the sensible decision to move closer to Galway. Well, we both did. And so we've lived here in this house for about 22 years or something now. For everyone, it's a challenge, but the lovely thing about teaching is it's a very extrovert, kind of communicative process, and so that's very stimulating and challenging. And then the process of working in the studio is maybe much more quiet and more of an introverted kind of experience, and I like that too. I like just being on my own in the studio and um, I suppose following my own intuition there. And then I like the structure of teaching and I like the challenge of it. Um, but I suppose it's hard to get the balance right. When you teach full time, you probably are more teaching than making. But having said that, I, whenever I have a big deadline, I'll kind of rise to the occasion and manage to do both. Um, and then sometimes I just make a big body of work in the summer, which is, kind of very important because you're kind of building up a sense of, your own practice again. My sister C was in publishing, and she's retired now, and I'm, like, in a way, I think we were all very creative. C was loved making things as well, and uh, she she also loved. She was very like my maternal grandmother. She loved animals, and so she's retired now, and like all of my siblings, loves reading as well. But she likes she's a very good horsewoman, so she's involved in dressage and things like that with her horse. Yeah. I mean, one of the things maybe she's instilled in all of us is curiosity. I mean, I think if you have curiosity in life, I think that keeps you going. If you're framing questions and asking questions of yourself and of others, and of where you live and why you do what you do, I think that helps. And she was always very intellectually outgoing as well, our mother, and very excited about new ideas. I mean, it's hard to think back to when she grew up, but one of the things was, I was saying, the whole thing of not being able to access certain kinds of information at the time, the way we can now. We didn't have the Internet of Things then. So that thing of finding information and learning about what's possible in the world, you kind of had to do that through your own curiosity, but it also depended on context. So our mother, she didn't go to formal school until she went to secondary school. So she was kind of homeschooled really up until that point. And she was saying she didn't learn to read and write. She didn't learn to write until she was like 9 or something. So she had a huge amount of freedom. And in a way, I think she gave that freedom, maybe not on purpose, but she gave that freedom to my brother and I because we had 2 older sisters, and I think she worked much harder at parenting them. Not that she didn't work at parenting us, but just by then, you know, she was just trying to make it work, and busy and things. And so we got given a lot of freedom, security. My father was very, he was somebody who loved, he had kind of rituals. He was a ritualist, I think, really. And so, he was very good company. He was a great conversationalist, but he liked being quiet too. So you could spend the day with him reading, and then at a certain point, he'd just say, "Well, will we have a cup of tea now?" And we'd have our cup of tea, and then we'd read some more, or we'd go for a walk together, But he was quite, he was very consistent, quite predictable, and I think that gives, children a lot of security when somebody's kind of quite predictable. And I remember asking him, well, in America, I remember people saying, did people not have a problem with you becoming an artist, because, it wasn't seen as a very profitable thing to decide to do. And I remember saying, "Oh yeah, no, I talked to my father about that, and he said, well, we didn't mind what you did as long as it made you happy, and you could support yourself, you know." So that was, he's very outgoing, very. She's very funny. She's one of the things that's kept her alive as well as her determination. So I mean, she only had her 99th in April, and a friend of ours happened to be in Dublin, and anyway, it turned out that my mother was already negotiating her 100th celebrations when she was 99, so she's very kind of optimistic. So yeah, no, I'm sure we do something very, very special. And yeah. The only thing that's, a terrible shame is that in the one side of my mother's family, our family, there's this very strong macular degeneration. So my mother has suffered from that terribly for particularly the last 10 years. And so her cousins would have suffered from it as well. It just means that, it's a terrible thing for an artist to have their sight reduced. And so that is something that has kind of frustrated her hugely over the last she doesn't allow things to take her down. It's all about battling against them and fighting them, or pretending they don't exist. And if you go for a drive with my mother, she tells you about everything that she can see. Whether she can see it or not, we don't know. I think she can see it sometimes, but it's everything. If she comes to this house, she remembers where there's kind of like a kind of rise in the floor. She says, "Oh, am I there yet?" She knows where everything is. She remembers. She's got a kind of photographic kind of picture of the lay of the land of places. One thing that was and still is very special about our mother is her humour. So even when we were small, she loved certain stories. So she loved Paddington Bear and Winnie the Pooh. But when she was kind of reading those stories to us, she would kill herself laughing. I mean, she really just thought they were the funniest things. And she still gets into this frame of mind where she looks at things and she just thinks some things are hilarious. And I was just with her last week and there's a picture of the two of us together, but my mother's just killing herself laughing, at something or other that we thought of, together. And so she's great. She's great company. I love just going out and, it's just about an hour and a half from here to go see my mother, and we have tea together and conversation and just have a lovely time chatting about things, and sometimes she starts killing herself laughing. And my brother says it's very funny. He now lives with her, and one of the things she does is she has Bluetooth on her hearing aid and she connects that to her iPad and she reads. And she reads all the time. That's her kind of thing that she does every day. And sometimes then it's dinner time, and so my mother will go in and sit at the table, and then she starts laughing at the table, and Richard realizes she hasn't turned her book off. And that was something that we were never allowed to read at the table, it was a real no-no. And then there she is, but I think, when you get to 99, you should be able to do whatever you want.